ॐ भूर्भुवः स्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। Peace, peace, peace. Namaste, my dear friends. This is video number 11 on Viveka Chudamani of Adi Sankaracharya. This video starts with verse number 137. What is bondage? The reply. Atrana atra anatam अन्य अहमिति मतिर्बंध ऐसो से पुंसे प्राप्तो ज्ञान जनन मरण कलेश संपात हेतु येने वायम विपुरिदम सत्यम असत्यम मिथ्या आत्म बुद्धया पुष्य तक्षु तैवती विषयी तंतुभि कोश कृदत. Due to his ignorance, man identifies the self with the not self. This is the bondage of man and brings in its wake the miseries of birth and death. Though through this he considers his perishable body as real, he identifies himself with it and nourishes, bathes, and preserves it with the help of sense objects. Thereby, he becomes bound like the silkworm in its cocoon, woven by its own threads. I am what I am, a confused, confounded entity. At one moment, I am a sweet little thing, at another, a terrible monster, because of the variety of gratifications of my physical demands of lusts, mental demands for emotional satisfactions, and because of my perturbed intellect tossed by its endless mischievous thoughts. Somehow I am aware of all this, yet I cannot get out of it. Why this helpless bondage? All these pernicious sorrows arise because I, the Atma, misunderstand myself to be the not self, Anatman. Suppose in a drunken mood you misunderstand yourself to be your own shadow. Terrible spring must then start for you. You find that you are lying down on the road and the traffic is incessantly passing over you. Your head is sometimes in the filthy wayside gutter. You refuse to move because you are being dragged. Thus, all the sufferings of the shadow become your sufferings. A simple misunderstanding that you are your shadow becomes the source of a chain of terrible springs. Similarly, the misunderstanding I am the Anatman is the springboard for all bondages and limitations that are suffered in voiceless agony by our personality. To end this misunderstanding would be redeeming at once our personality from the encrustations of matter and its tyranny. One who is released from the tyrannies of matter is a God-man on earth, perfect, free, liberated totally from the weaknesses which characterize a mortal. God apparently suffering the sorrows of persecuting matter is man. In the dream, when I forget my real nature, I identify with the things projected by me in the dream and suffer the consequences. The sufferings of the dream last only till I got up. The moment I wake up and realize my real nature, all the sorrows of the dream end. When in a drunken state I forget my real nature, I keep the wrong relationship with the world around me and consequently I come to suffer. A madman, because of some psychological changes in him, forgets himself and starts behaving wrongly in the world around him. In the same manner, I, who am I God, the Paramatman, the pure self, not understanding myself in the non apprehension of my real nature, start creating misapprehensions. Then, identifying myself with the not self which I am not, I come to suffer the pains of existence created by myself for myself. This identification with the not self in each one of us is the cause of our life's springs. In a cinema hall, we identify ourselves with the heroes or the heroines on the screen. We feel happy at their happiness and agony at their sorrows. As a result of this bondage, which is nothing other than our identification with the not self, the Atma, which is never born nor ever dies, which is ever the same, eternal, pure, seems to suffer the pangs of an apparent birth and death. Such a fall from the height of an eternal, everlasting state of perfection to the ever changing, ephemeral state of imperfection is caused by this identification alone. The unreal is that which was not and that which shall never be, but only apparently exists. This is otherwise called an illusion. The body which was not there before birth and shall not be there after death, but is only temporarily existent, must fall under the category of the unreal, but because of man's spiritual ignorance and his consequent bondages, this body, which is mortal, is considered by him as his real nature. When this body is not only considered real, but in total identification with it, when a man asserts that the body alone is real, then there can be only one duty in life for him. That duty is to fatten, to nourish, to feed it, and to enjoy himself thoroughly. Here we have the true life picture of what we are. Think of the tragedy. You must attend to this body constantly all the 24 hours of all the 365 days of a year, nay, one day more in a leap year. There is no escape, you must be with it all the time without any holiday. An all time servant you become of your own body. You can have a release from your office, home, friends, society, from everything, but not from this body, catering, mission in life. Because of this identification, you must preserve this body, feed it, clothe it, treat it when ill, and when necessary, it must also get a blood transfusion or a heart transplant. It is not sufficient that we look after and preserve the body, but we must also run after all the objects desired by it: house, car, radio, air conditioner, television, and what not. Why am I living so contentedly in this slavery? Because this body is me, my body's happiness is my happiness. Once we are under the hallucination that we are worms, we certainly become afraid of all insectivorous birds. This fear will vanish only when we are convinced that we are human beings and not worms. No matter how many times a psychiatrist tells us that we are not worms, it will not help us if we do not realize that we are human beings. Similarly, however much the teacher may tell us that we are the Paramatman, we may read and study books like the Viveka Chudamani, we may attend satsangs and discuss in body in study groups, but deep down in ourselves we are convinced that we are this body only. Why? Because of the avidya, the non-apprehension of our real divine spiritual nature. The silkworm spins fine threads from its own saliva and weaves a cocoon around itself. The cocoon becomes stronger and stronger until at last the worm gets entangled in it and cannot come out. Similarly, once the misunderstanding that I am the body has arisen, this false notion makes endless demands for the preservation of the body. These demands multiply and they become so strong that the individual gets gagged and bound by them. Under the circumstances, your personality becomes conditioned by these endless demands, and your essential vitalities, capacities, and intelligence fail to bloom and express themselves as they get shackled and conditioned at all times by your past, which you have woven into inescapable patterns around yourself. All this arose from one and the same springboard. You forgot yourself. You lived all along misunderstanding yourself to be the matter equipment of BMI, the not self and Atman. In this condition, you come to experience sufferings. This is called bondage, Sansara, Dukkham. Stanza number 138. Et asmimam sat buddhi prabhavati vimudhasya tamsa viveka abhava vadai safurti bhujge rajju dhishana tato anarth vrato niptati samada turdhik satato यो सद आग्रह स ही भवति बंध है शरण सखी When one is overcome by ignorance, one mistakes a thing for what it is not. In the absence of discrimination, the snake is mistaken for a rope, and great danger befalls him who seizes it through this false notion. To listen, my friend, it is mistaking the not self for the self, the unreal for the real, that creates bondage. Now, ataha, meaning having forgotten one's real nature, projecting oneself into the not self, anatman, considering oneself to be the BMI, tending the body in many different ways, and getting self bound like a silkworm in its cocoon. What happens after this is described in this verse. In this, the idea of that Atmasm Tattva Buddhi in this body to maintain the feeling that this is reality is in this the understanding of that such a wrong idea can come only to a supremely foolish man. This foolishness is the result of tamas, the non-apprehension of reality, which overwhelms an individual when the potential discriminative power of his intellect is not available to him under the binding effects of tamas. Such a thing generally happens in the dream condition. The intellect is slowly overcome by sleep. The 100% discriminative power available during the waking condition slowly gets clouded, and about 90% of it gets veiled by sleep. With 10% discrimination, when I look at my own thoughts, I start living in the dream world projected by my mind. When I wake up from my dream, the full power of discrimination is available to me, and my dream rolls away. The dream cannot exist in the light of full discrimination. Much the same thing happens when a respectable man's decency has been swallowed up by half a bottle of whiskey, or by a couple of LSD pills, or by a few puffs of opium. When 95% of the discrimination hitherto available for remaining 5%, when he moves about he feels funny and starts seeing things which are not there. A stranger who is walking peacefully on the road mistakes a lamp post for his brother and feels like embracing him. Another man who is standing on the footpath appears to be a lamp post and he feels like leaning on it. Even the gutter looks inviting enough for a nap. If such a drunken fool is given 2 or 3 blows on his head, his discrimination suddenly increases and he starts behaving more decently. Similarly, what we think is 100% discrimination in our waking condition is, in fact, only 5% of the total possibility of discrimination lying dormant in us. If this total potential discriminative power becomes available, meaning if tamas has been completely eliminated and the intellect has become pure, then by such sattvic intellect one comes to comprehend the truth all by oneself. To a sattvic intellect, truth is self evident. A foolish man's intellect gets veiled by tamas and he suffers from lack of discrimination. In that tragic condition, he comes to understand the Anatman as the Atman. This misapprehension is explained by Sankara with an illustration. In the snake, the understanding of a rope by a simple twist of the snake in the rope example, the great artist in Sankara has brought home a wealth of understanding necessary to the students of Vedanta. If a snake is believed to be an innocent rope, when some use is found for the rope, and if a person runs to catch hold of it, imagine the unnecessary agony which the fool is bargaining for. What would be the condition of such a madman who drags the snake thinking it to be a useful rope? The Acharya indicates that this is precisely what is happening in our lives. The body is misunderstood as the Atma, the Self, that is all. The consequences are a house, car, a wife, plenty of money, anxieties of how to procure it, having procured it, how to keep it, and having kept it, the responsibility of guarding it day and night, radio, television, air conditioning, pleasures, parties, entertainments, and recreations. All these can heap unnecessary, meaningless agonies, anartvarta, upon our heads. The more we identify with the body, the more are our life's botherations. Thus, holding on to an unreal thing becomes the essence of all bondage. This is the second definition of bondage. The first definition was in the previous worth, where it was declared that considering the anatman to be the self was bondage. Bondage is nothing other than the identification with the unreal, the perishable, the changeable, the variable, the mutable, together called the anatman. The not self, Adi Sankaracharya in this verse addresses the reader as friend. Listen, O friend, he says, this spirit of camaraderie brings the mighty master to our level. First, the teacher explained what was an Atman. Then he explained what was Atman. Now he is explaining the nature of bondage. In the unhappy wedlock of Atman and Anatman, this ego is created, and in each of us it is this ego which supplies our sense of limitations, the bondages in life. Stanza number 139. अखंड नित्य द्वे बोध शक्तया सफुर अंतर अंतमा आत्म मनंत वैभवम समावरणो त्यावर्ति शक्ति रेशा तमोमयी राहुर वार्क बिंबम आवृत्ति. The wailing power is of the nature of tamas, ignorance. It covers the self whose glories are infinite, which is indivisible, eternal, and one without a second, just as Rahu covers the sun during a solar eclipse. In these verses, Sankara revels in the irrepressible surge of his poetry. Though there is not much progress in the flow of ideas, Sankara delights here in his subjective experience of Brahma. This great self is immutable, eternal, and one without a second. The glory of the self is never away from us. It is always present in us, illumining both the inner pulsations of the mind and the outer presence of objects. Even though this consciousness is always present in us. It is not readily available for our cognition because of the veiling over it created by tamas. How does this great consciousness come to be covered by tamas? How can ignorance cover knowledge? Sankara answers this doubt by an illustrative example from nature, just as the sun covered by Rahu during the solar eclipse. The phenomenon of the solar eclipse is explained with characteristic poetic expression in Hindu mythology. It is said that Rahu, a demon, swallows the sun during the eclipse, but Rahu is a demon having only a head and no trunk. So when he swallows the sun by the mouth, it emerges out from his neck. Here is science wedded to poetry. When the moon comes between the sun and the observer on the earth, the phenomenon is termed as the solar eclipse. In fact, the moon only covers the sun from the vision of the observer. How can the moon really cover the sun? The moon is comparatively smaller than the sun. The moon does not and cannot cover the sun. Since the sun is so far and the moon is nearer, and the observer on the earth is so very much smaller than both, it appears as though the moon has covered the sun. All the same, the moon has obstructed the observer's vision of the sun. From his standpoint, the sun is completely covered. If we could move away from even a little from the shadow of the moon, we will see that the sun is not covered at all. For those who could rise above the moon, there would be no solar eclipse at all. If there were inhabitants on the sun, they would not even to be conscious of the eclipse. In Hindu mythology, the moon is the presiding deity of the mind. The sun, the illuminating factor, is equated with the Atman, the self. Applying the above example subjectively, as long as there is this mind between me and myself, the glory of the self is veiled from me. Mind is the manifestation of avidya, the non-apprehension of reality caused by tamas. Transcendent the mind and there is no pluralistic perception. Realize the self and all sufferings will end. Stanza number 140. तिरोभूते सव आत्म अन्ने मल तरे तेजोवती पुमा अन आत्मन्नम मोहादहमिति शरीरम कलयति ततः काम क्रोध प्रभृति भ्रमुम बंधन गुण ही परम विक्षिप्ख्या रजस उरु शक्तिर व्यथयति राहुर वार्क बिंबम. When a man's own self of purest splendor is hidden from his direct experience, that man, due to ignorance, comes to falsely identify himself with his body, which is the not self. Then the merciless persecution of Rajas projecting power binds him down with fetters of lust and anger, etc. When the immaculate divine light of wisdom, the great light of consciousness, is veiled from a man, he comes to consider the body, which is the not self, as his real self. When his power of discrimination gets clouded by the gathering tamas in him, the self appears to be veiled, and he, not knowing his real nature, believes himself to be his own body. Body here means all the three bodies, gross, subtle, and causal. Then the whole gang of negative tendencies Desire, anger, greed, delusion, passion, and jealousy come to bind his personality to his lower ego, and as a sansarin, he lives in pains and agonies. All the thoughts in the human mind can be classified under the above six categories, and all the six have the quality of binding the individual to the lower, to the baser aspect of his personality. Qualities are called gunas, and in Sanskrit, guna also means rope. These gunas, ropes, shackle man is a statement employing a pleasant pun upon the word guna. When the knowledge of the self is veiled by tamas, the concept of I am the body comes first. Then, consequently, the baser agitations arise in the mind and bind the individual. Thereafter, he has no freedom at all to live a life of spiritual bliss. There are six types of emotions which arise in the ignorant man: desire, kama, anger, krodha, greed, lobha, delusion, moha, passion, mada, and jealousy, matsarya. All these spring from the power of agitations in the mind, vikshepa. When this power projects the world of likes and dislikes, the individual gets afflicted and suffers the agonies of life in the world. All this suffering is because of tamoguna acting as the wailing and rajoguna acting as the agitations in the mind. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas are together Maya. The avidya, the causal body, karna, srira, or are indicated as the vasanas. This is the trick by which the mind seduces each individual by its magic of illusions, and they sustain their meaningless existence in a world of dire limitations. The way of life by which we can remove them all is spiritual life. Remove them all and know what you are, the infinite divine self. Then come to revel in the world using the vehicle of BMI which has been given to you so that you may play and enjoy the world and not feel it as a cross to be carried on your shoulder for your own crucifixion. Stanza number 141. महामोह ग्राह ग्रश नगलती आत्मान वगमनो धियो नाना अवस्थाम स्वयं भी गुणतया अपारे संसारे विषया विस्पुरे जल निधो निमज्जो जन्म जायम भ्रमति कोमति कुत्सित गति. An individual who has a perverted intellect, whose knowledge of his self has been swallowed by the shark of complete ignorance, behaves as through the different states of his intellect were the natures of the self, and drifts up and down, now rising and now sinking on the ocean of change which is full of the poison of sense pleasures. Indeed, what a calamitous fate! When an individual's self knowledge is swallowed up by the shark of delusion, tamas, he dances to the tune of his intellect according to the various conditions of its likes and dislikes, just as a drunkard behaves, forgetting that he is a decent, respectable man. Depending upon the innate individual tendencies, vasanas, various thoughts arise in a man, and he is compelled to act according to their dictates. His condition becomes like that of a neglected boat in a stormy ocean, in the ocean of sansar, which is whipped up by waves of dangerous and poisonous sense enchantments. This neglected boat is tossed about, now rising, now sinking. This ocean of sansar is indeed very difficult to cross. Thus, when a man acts in the world outside, his actions accumulate more and more vasanas in him. Vasanas create more and more thoughts. More the thoughts, more is the activity, and more are the fresh vasanas generated and entangled in an endless chain of activity. Man suffers. In the study of Vedanta, it is not sufficient that a student very seriously reads the text verse by verse. He must also note the arrangement of ideas, as this in itself has a voiceless content which clears many of his doubts. In this text also, first the qualities of a guru and a disciple were explained. It was dramatized how a perfect master and a perfect student meet, and when they meet, what were their respective duties. Then the discrimination between Atma and Anatman was taken up. Next, the Atman, the self, was explained, followed by the description of the Anatman, the not self. Here again, Sankara emphasizes how the nature of the Atma gets veiled from our cognition, and how the Rajas and Tamas qualities condemn an individual. When so much has been explained, there will still be a vestige of doubt in the minds of the students who have followed the arguments closely. It has been said that in all our sufferings we are not aware of the reality in us, because it is lying veiled from our vision by avidya. How can this be? How can my ignorance of a thing give me solid perceptible sorrows? The following verse gives the answer in the form of an example. Stanza number 142. Bhanu Prabha Sanjan ब्रह्मणस्ति भानु तिरोधाय विजर्भते यथा आतम द्वि अहंकृति आतम तत्वम तथा तिरोधाय विजर्भते स्वयं. As the formations of clouds generated by the sun's rays come to veil the very same sun and appear clearly manifest in the sky, so too the ego arisen from the self covers the reality of the self and expresses itself in full manifestation. Had there been no sunlight and no sun's heat, there would have been no clouds. The arrays of clouds born out of the sunlight cover it and vividly manifest themselves. Similarly, the ego, the PFT born out of Om, the reality says, I alone am, when the consciousness functions through the equipment of BMI, the concept of PFT, the doer enjoyer feeling is born. Thereafter, this ego appears and starts saying, where is God? I am the only truth. What is there besides me? Out of this psychological phenomenon are born all the sufferings of man. This is exhaustively explained in the following verse. Verse number 43. The powers agitating and wailing. कौलित दिन नाथे दुर्दिने सांद्र मेघे व्यर्थयति हिम झंझा वायुरुग्रे यथैतान अविरत तमस मान्य व्यर्ते मूढ़ बुद्धिम akshapyati bahudha khasatir shakti. Just as on a cloudy day when the sun is swallowed up by the dense clouds, cold shivering blast persecute man, so too when the Atma is screened off by utter ignorance, the dreadful projecting power Vivekshepa Shakti persecutes the foolish man with endless sorrows. The lord of the day is the sun, Dinanath. When it is covered by dense clouds, the day is said to be cloudy. On a sunless wintry day, the terrible icy cold breeze persecutes the living beings on the face of the earth. Those who are not under the shadows of such a miserable cloudy day are happy and are not persecuted. Those who are on the other side of the clouds have no suffering. Similarly, the fools in whom the knowledge of the self is veiled by dense tamas, ignorance, come to suffer the endless varieties of persecutions of matter provided by the dreadful power of agitations, Vikshepa Shakti. But from the point of view of the Atma and those who are self-realized, the avidya and avidya created egocentric individuality has no existence at all. When I look as an egocentric as a PFT, the ignorance is very near me. The self is far away from me. Thus we can say that when the ego looks through tamas, he finds that the Atma is not there. He is a fool who lives totally identified with the BMI. He then comes to suffer the imperfections of the OET. He is afflicted by the power of agitations. Thereafter, a thousand varieties of sorrows dog his heels wherever he goes, just as cold breeze afflict the people when the clouds cover the sun. The power of agitation afflicts the individualized ego when tamas covers the Atman. It is not only that we do not know the Atma, but at the same time we are afflicted with various kinds of sorrows and agitations equal to shivering in the cold wind. Stanza number 144. एताभ्यामेव शक्तिभ्यां बन्धः पुंसः समागतः याभ्यां विमोहितो देहं मत्वा आत्मानं भ्रमतयम्. Man's bondage has sprung forth from these two powers, deluded by then he mistakes his body for the self and wanders from life to life. Because of these two powers of willing and agitations, man has reached his present stage of bondage and has become limited. When an individual allows himself to be confused and beguiled by these two, Avarna Shakti and Vikshepa Shakti, he considers himself to be his body, gross, subtle, and causal bodies. Normally, everyone believes himself to be his gross body. An emotional person may consider himself to be an emotional personality. A modern rational man may think of himself as an intellectual. Thus confused, they move about satisfying their physical, emotional, and intellectual needs. Each man acts in his peculiar delusion. Thus they move like madmen from one place to another, from one time to another, from one life to another, from one cradle to one grave and another cradle to another grave, alas, continuously. Bondage in action, stanza number 145. बीजम संसरति भूमि जस्य तो तमो दे आतम धीर अंकुरो राग पल्लभ बंबो क्रम तो वपो सकंधो सव सखिका अग्राणी इंद्रिय सहतिश्च विषया पुष्पाणि दुःखम फलम नाना क्रम संभो भवम बहुविधम भोक्तात्र जीवः खग. Ignorance is the seed for the tree of sansar. Body identification is the sprout. Desires are its tender leaves. Work is its water. The body is its trunk. The pranas are its branches. The sense organs are its twigs. The sense objects are its flowers. Different miseries born out of varieties of actions are the fruits, and the individual jiva is the bird perched upon it. The picture of the tree of life or the tree of sansar is etched here by Sankara, his philosopher's pen moving with the throbbings of his poetic heart. The seed for this tree of sansar is tamas, which is synonymous with avidya, ignorance, vasanas, causal body, and non-apprehension of reality. If the seed is once roasted in fire, that is, if the vasanas are burnt in the fire of knowledge, there would no more be any tree at all. The sprout is the intellectual conception and strong conviction that this body is the self, which is of course the first expression of avidya. The first couple of tender leaves are the desires. As long as I do not recognize the self, I consider myself to be the body. When I am the body, I am anxious to preserve it. I want this, I want that. Thus all desires start. Desires are expressed in two ways, likes and dislikes. The couple of leaves, the growth of the tree can be arrested even at this level by destroying the sprout, or at least by neglecting to water it. The water is the egocentric activity undertaken to fulfill the desires of the body. At this stage, the growth of the tree can be prevented by stopping the supply of water. In case it is not possible to stop the watering, the addition of 2 drops of nitric acid will do the trick. If in the activities of the ego 2 drops of the spirit of dedication are added, the tree will soon be destroyed. Therefore, dedicated activity, niskama karma, is advocated here, which will ultimately destroy the vasanas, the very seeds. The trunk is the body. If activity is undertaken motivated by desires, the tree grows stronger and comes the trunk, which is the gross body in each one of us. The branches are the pranas. The pranas are 5 in number: prana, apana, samana, vyana, udana. As the 5 main branches of life's activity, these maintain the body and its functions, just as the branches maintain the trunk of the tree. The twigs are the sense organs. They depend upon the pranas. If the branches are removed, the twigs cannot remain. When the pranas depart, the sense organs can no longer function. The sense organs are of 2 types: the organs of perception and the organs of action. They are so named because of their spatial functions of reception of stimuli and responses in the world outside. The flowers are the sense objects. They always have the tendency to attract. Each sense organ has its sense objects, just as each twig has its flower. All sense objects can be classified under forms and colors, smells, sounds, tastes, and touches. The classification depends upon the organs of perception, just as the flowers depend upon the twigs. The fruits are the sorrows created by the endless varieties of actions performed in different modes for the egocentric mind. When an individual is attracted by any sense object, the information about its enchanting existence is brought by the organ of perception. He desires first to possess it, then hungers to enjoy it. Here he acts with his organ of action, and actions must produce reactions. These are called fruits of actions born out of the flowers of sense objects. The actions are of various kinds depending upon the mode in which they are performed, the triple modes being sattva, rajas, and tamas. The fruits thus created are always sorrowful because, from the standpoint of the Absolute, the state of everlasting happiness, the little ephemeral and short lived happiness gained through the sense objects in this welter of change sansar is really sorrowful. Also, the fruits always contain seeds, thus, the fruits of actions are replete with vasanas, the seeds for continuing sansar. The enjoyer of the fruits is the individual who moves about, flitting about from one branch to another, like a bird. A fruit bearing tree is never fulfilled unless there are the enjoyers of the fruits. The jiva, the individuality, is compared to the bird because it sits on the tree, enjoys its fruits, and also takes shelter in its shade. The moment it finds that the tree is no more useful to its purpose, it flies away and finds yet another tree. Similarly, the individuality in each one of us flies from body to body, from time to time, when each previous body has become useless for the great purpose of its evolution. The ego is the bird which enjoys the fruits of action born out of different activities performed under the different urges. The fruits are born out of the flowers, the sense objects. The flowers are born out of the twigs, the sense organs. The twigs belong to the branches, the physiological functions. These in turn take place in the trunk, the body. The body has grown because it has been steadily watered by karma. In the beginning, there were only two tender leaves, the desires and attachments. These came from the sprout from the idea I am the body. All this came from the seed of ignorance, the non apprehension of reality caused by tamas. Stanza number 146. अज्ञान मूलो यमनातम बंधो नैसर्गिक नादरी अनंत इदीरितः जन्माप्यव्ययाधि जरा दुख प्रवापातम जन्य मुष्य. This bondage caused by the not self springs from ignorance and is self caused. It is described as without beginning and without end. It subjects one to the endless flood of miseries, birth, death, disease, and senility. How sorrow is the result of the misconception that the not self anatman is the self atman is explained in this verse. Non-apprehension of the post creates the illusion that there is a ghost Non-apprehension of reality alone creates the misapprehension that I am this body. How and where did this misunderstanding of the Anatman to be the Atman arise? When did the absolute become the relative? Such questions in terms of time and space often arise in our minds. Ignorance is said to be self caused. It is not caused by any other cause. It is the nature of the cave to have darkness. Darkness in the cave is created by the cave. If the cave were not there, there would be no darkness. Similarly, when the self is not known, there is darkness in the bosom. In terms of the intellect, all that can be said is that this avidya is without beginning and without end, meaning it is essentially beyond time. As long as there is the concept of time, the samsara experiences will be there because time is the medium in which samsara is perceived. The moment time is transcended, samsara also must end. Beginning and end are meaningful only in the medium of time. The sorrows of samsara arising out of this identification with the anatman unavoidably manifest as the agonies of birth, the pains of growth, the discomforts of decay, the fears of old age, the pangs of disease, and the tragedies of death. The cause for all these is ignorance and the consequent identification with the not self. If all the sorrows are to be removed, the cause for them has to be removed. Ignorance can be removed only by the first hand experience of the infinite reality. Stanza number 147. Atman and Anatman discrimination. नास्त्रेण शास्त्रेण नीलेन वहिन्ना छेतुम न शक्यो न चय कर्म कोटिभिः विवेक विज्ञान महासिना बिना धातु प्रसादेन सीतेन मज्जुना. Neither by weapons, nor by wind, nor by fire, nor by millions of actions can this bondage be destroyed. By nothing save the wondrous word of knowledge which comes from discrimination and is sharpened by the purification of the mind and the intellect can we end this bondage. All the sorrows of samsara arise out of the confusion between the Atma and the Anatman, the self and the non-self. In order to end these sorrows, this confusion has to be ended. This confusion is called bondage. How can one cut this bondage? How can one destroy and end it? Weapons of destruction are of two types. But number one, when the weapon leaves the hand of the wielder, then whether it strikes the target or not, it never comes back. Two, when it leaves the hand of the wielder, it strikes the target and returns just like the guided missiles of today. The former type of weapon is called the astra and the latter is called as the shastra. These are the two types of weapons of destruction known to mankind with which the whole world can be destroyed. But the confusion of the Atma with the Anatma, the idea that I am the body, cannot be destroyed by either of these two types of weapons. Wind and fire are nature's power of annihilation. Wind dries up things and destroys them. Fire destroys them by burning them. The conviction that I am the body, this ignorance can neither be dried up nor can it be burnt down. Habits or even some of the Imbecilities can be changed by acting contrary to them. Activity is another instrument with which human beings can put an end to habits, tendencies, urges, etc. But avidya cannot be ended by even millions of activities because avidya is the very cause for all activities. Thus, this avidya cannot be ended by any non-scientific instrument of annihilation, nor by any of nature's rupturing reactions resulting in destruction, nor by millions of activities, noble or ignoble. This is precisely the despair of existentialism. The way out is given in the last two lines of this verse. Mere erudition will never be sufficient. At best, it can puncture ignorance, but it cannot cut it down. So, this non apprehension can be ended only by the sword of discrimination, which results in the first hand experience of the pure self. This sword has to be sharpened by the cleansing of the inner instruments, the mind and the intellect. Dhatu prasada. The term as used here means purification of the inner instrument. This purification can be done by reducing the vasanas, for when vasanas are reduced, agitations of the mind are reduced. Quieter the mind, the greater is the contemplative power in man, and a developed power of contemplation makes his discrimination sharper. With this sharpened sword alone can the confusion between the self and the not self be finally removed. Stanza number 148. Shruti pramane kamte savdharam nishtha tavai atam vishuddhir se vishuddh buddhi parmatam vedanam tannayo sansar samulnash. He who has deep devotion to the Shrutis and who is established in his Savdharma, for these alone contribute to the purity of his mind and is of pure mind, realizes the Supreme Self. By this knowledge alone is sansar destroyed, root and branch. The man whose intellect is soaked in the knowledge of the Upanishads, whose mind has become single pointedly devoted to the truths declared in the scriptures, Shrutis, that man alone is really able to walk steadily the narrow path of Savdharma. Savdharma is the nature dharma of one's own self, Sava. He who has knowledge of the self alone will be able to live the nature of the self. Else again and again he will slip into the natural idea I am the body. When one lives selflessly for a long period of time, according to the dictates of Swadharma, one's mind and intellect become purer and purer, meaning calmer and quieter. When one works in the world dedicatedly without the ego and the egocentric desires, the existing vasanas get exhausted and no new vasanas are created. When there are no vasanas, there can be no agitations in the mind. The mind becomes calm and quiet. A calm mind is a pure mind. In the pure mind alone is the experience of the Supreme Self possible. An agitated mind cannot apprehend reality. Knowledge of the Shrutis gained through sincere daily reading and continuous reflection upon them facilitates selfless and dedicated activity, which helps one to quieten the mind. Then, as an irresistible sequence, the experience of the reality floods the seeker's heart. It is always understood that the Experience of reality is not the result of sadhana. Sadhana only purifies the mind, and in a pure mind, recognition of the reality is unavoidable. The ego disappears into the vision divine. Vedana means right understanding. With a purified intellect alone can one understand the words of the scriptures and the instructions of the Guru. Otherwise, it will be merely some dry, unproductive book knowledge. Such knowledge is like writing the word sugar in more than one language on a piece of paper and leaking it for gaining the experience of its sweetness. Thus, if a person has gained an intuitive glimpse of the reality, even for a brief moment, sansar, the perception and persecutions of the ever changing phenomenal world is destroyed, root and branch. The root is the non-apprehension of reality avidya. Ending sansar along with its root means when truth is apprehended, non-apprehension of reality vanishes and the consequent misapprehensions depart from the bosom of a man of true God realization. Stanza number 149. कोसर अन्नमया दई पंचभिरात्मा ने संवेरतो भाति निज शक्ति समुक्त पनई सवाल पटलरी वाम्बो वापि सथम covered by the five seeds such as the food seed which are produced by its own divine power, the self ceases to appear just as the water in a tank ceases to appear due to the collection of moss which is born out of itself water. The change in the meter of poetry is generally adopted to seek up the student or the reader to full wakefulness and to make him understand that the thought which was being discussed so far has ended. This stanza is a typical example. The Atma is covered by the five seats, and so at the moment it is not readily available for our direct cognition. The five seats are the food seat, the vital air seat, the mental seat, the intellectual seat, and the bliss seat. They, they apparently cover the Atma from direct vision and are born out of Atman's own power divine called Maya. By its own power of projection, the self has created these five seats, and by identifying with them, it seems to get covered by them. There is a kind of moss which grows in still water. It is a green granulated plant which covers the surface of the pond water so completely that the water can no longer be seen. A completely green surface alone is visible at all times, and from a distance it may look like a lawn. When the moss covers the water, the beauty of the shining sun is no longer reflected in it. If the moss is pushed aside, it will move away to reveal the brilliant reflection of the sun. But as soon as the hand is removed from the water, the moss returns to cover the reflective surface of water. The Vasana created agitations and the perceptions of the pluralistic phenomenal world are like the moss in our minds. Because of them, the mind is not clear, is not pure enough to reflect the divinity behind it. To remove this moss is to remove the ego and the egocentric desires while acting in the world. The mind which is running towards the OET should be turned in contemplation towards the reality. When this moss is even slightly removed from the mind, consciousness which is always present gets reflected in the clear waters of the mind's divine thoughts. Children may run and slip into the lawn like moss expanse and suffocate and die in it, but An intelligent man who knows that it is only moss covering the waters will not walk into it. When the moss is pushed aside by the hand, immediately the water manifests itself. But if one removes the hand and sits back even for a moment, thinking that all has been achieved, the Maya returns and covers the self again by blanketing the reflective surface of the mind. The best way to remove the moss is to make the water overflow the tank. Let in more water to flood and flush out the tank. Study, reflection, and contemplation will bring new streams of spiritual thoughts into the mind. When they overflow the mind in its devotion and service, what overflows first will be this moss which obstructs the vision of the self. Stanza number 150. तच्छैवालापन्यै सम्यक् सलीलं प्रतीयते शुद्धं तृणासन्तापहरं सद्यसौख्यप्रदं परं पुषः. When the moss is removed, absolutely pure water which can quench the pangs of thirst and give immediate joy becomes visible. When the moss is removed, pure and clear water can be seen. This moss has the properties of fixing and absorbing all the impurities in the water. Wherever it is present, the water beneath it is supposed to be extremely pure and clean. The sorrow arising from thirst can be immediately be removed by this pure water. The thirst can be quenched. Thirst, Trishna, is a word traditionally used in spiritual lore for sense indulgences. Indulgences in sense objects is the cause for all the troubles of the world. Apprehension of reality ends all the troubles of sansar, and the thirst for sense objects is quenched only when truth is apprehended. One cannot quench one's thirst by eating the moss. Drinking water alone can quench thirst. Identification with the seeds will never give anyone lasting happiness. Realization of one's true nature alone will give eternal bliss. The moss is not water, though it is born out of water. The five seeds Panchakosa are not the self, though they are born out of the Atma. So I conclude this video at this stage. Next video number 12 will start with stanza number 151 of the Viveka Chudamani of Adi Sankaracharya. Thank you. Namaskar.